I'm Karen Hansen-Kuhn. I'm Program Director at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. IATP works locally and globally to ensure fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade systems. We are hosting this webinar today with our partner ANEC, the Asociación Nacional de Empresas Comercializadoras de Productores del Campo, a Mexican organization that we have worked with for more than 20 years. At IATP, a lot of our work is on analyzing the aspects of trade policy or trade agreements that could have implications for agriculture, climate change, and equity. But we're also trying to advance agroecology as the alternative. And we think about agroecology not only as a different kind of production, but also as an expression of democracy, human rights, and food sovereignty. And I think that's what makes this experience, this initiative in Mexico, so important. It is the result of that interplay between social movements, scientists, and government. And on our side in the US, we'll hear about the pushback being led by corporations who assert that somehow these rules to phase out glyphosate and GMOs don't meet their expectations under the new NAFTA, USMCA. So we'll hear about that and a legal initiative challenging EPA's ruling on the safety of glyphosate in this country. So I'd like to welcome you to what I think will be a really interesting event. And I would like to give Leticia López from ANEC a moment to introduce the event. I would also add, this webinar will have simultaneous translation in Spanish and English. You'll see an interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. You need to click that and select the language you'd like to hear. We will be showing the slides in English, but Spanish slides are available and we'd be happy to email them to you. So we'll get back to some housekeeping issues before we start, but I'd like to give the floor to Leticia for any words of welcome.
Buenos días, Karen. Buenos días a todas y todos. Soy Leticia López Cepeda de la Dirección Ejecutiva de la Asociación Nacional de Empresas Comercializadoras Campesinas de Productores del Campo. ANEC es una organización campesina que tiene una dirección ejecutiva y tiene un órgano de dirección
that has an administrative body with various producers of different states that produce sorghum, rice, corn, and all sorts of different products. So the ANEC has a very careful and posed vision for this this industry. This is going to be a very important meeting today due to the social, economic, and environmental crises that we're facing, and the major challenges that we have been facing for many years. I hope that this webinar will strengthen our resolve and help us face down the challenges that we have in front of us. We have several people here today that are going to help us process all this information. And we hope that it's going to be very fruitful, and going forward, we have a lot of work to do. So thank you so much, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Leticia. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few sort of housekeeping issues on how we run the webinar. I think there may be a slide, but I'd like to draw your attention to the Zoom webinar control panel at the bottom. Please, you can ask questions of presenters at any time by typing it into the Q&A box. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the session, and I hope we've left plenty of time for discussion. I would suggest not putting them in the chat function, as we won't be monitoring that as closely. As I said, the webinar is happening in Spanish and English. Please be sure to select the translate interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. And also the webinar is being recorded. We will be posting it in both Spanish and English on our website and circulating the recording to everyone who registered for the event. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Jennifer Clapp. She will help us understand why glyphosate is a problem and what corporate actors are driving its use. Jennifer Clapp is Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability and Professor of School of the Environment, Resources, and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. She's published widely on the global governance problems that arise at the intersection of global economy, food security, food systems, and the natural environment. Jennifer is Vice Chair of the Steering Committee of the High-Level Panel of Experts of the UN Committee on World Food Security and a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. She's currently working on a book on corporate concentration in the agricultural input industry. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Karen, for that introduction. I'm happy to be here today. And as explained, I will be speaking on the factors behind the growing dependence of modern industrial agriculture on herbicides and glyphosate in particular. Next slide, please. So as we all know, there's been an enormous growth in the use of glyphosate in recent decades. And we see here from the 1990s to 2014, there's been a 15-fold increase in its use. And we don't have the more recent data, or at least it's not publicly available. We can only assume it's continued to rise. Today, glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide. Next slide, please. And we know that glyphosate is problematic, and I know other speakers will probably speak to the health concerns and environmental concerns around it. But I wanted to show in this slide one of the agricultural concerns, which is the growing resistance of weeds to glyphosate. It's really exploded in recent decades. And this is a problem because if glyphosate isn't actually working as a herbicide, it means often agricultural producers are turning to even more toxic herbicides to control weeds. Next slide, please. And while glyphosate is increasing everywhere globally, I wanted to show this slide of what's happening in the United States, where you can see over time between the 1990s and 2019, the intensity of the increased use. And this is a similar story, as I said, happening around the world. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about is the drivers of this growing glyphosate use. So why is it going through the roof? So I want to outline some of the key phases that we've seen in terms of the changing dynamics that have led to increased glyphosate use, as well as the underlying dynamic of corporate consolidation and power in recent decades. Next slide, please. So initially, glyphosate was introduced by Monsanto in 1974, and we know it's called Roundup, brand of herbicide. And at the time it was first introduced, it was widely considered to be a perfect herbicide, so to speak. It was highly effective, and it was considered to be less toxic than other chemical herbicides on the market at the time. And the way that it works is it's non-selective, and that means it basically kills whatever you spray it on. And farmers initially used glyphosate to clear the fields in the spring or the fall. In other words, it was used on either side of a planting season in order to prepare fields for cultivation. And at the time that it was introduced and in the early decade of its use, it was just one of several herbicides on the market that could serve that function, and its use was not particularly high. Next slide, please. But a key change began in the mid-1980s, where there was the idea to repurpose glyphosate for use with agricultural biotechnology. And a couple of reasons that this happened. Corporate players at the time who were herbicide producers started to see increasing costs, as well as increasing amounts of time that it took to bring new herbicides onto the market. And this context made it very attractive for these firms to invest in agricultural biotechnology, which was faster and cheaper for them to do. And it made sense for them because the patent for glyphosate was due to expire in the year 2000, and they were trying to get ahead of things. They were trying to basically come up with a way to engineer seeds to make plants resistant to spraying of glyphosate, so they could then make money off of selling both the genetically modified seeds as well as continued sales of the herbicide. Because if you make the seed resistant to herbicide, it will basically make a greater market for the sale of both herbicides and seeds. Next slide, please. And this slide simply shows how these costs and the amount of time it took to bring a new herbicide to market changed and really expanded over time. And if you click, Colleen, if you make a click right now, yeah, that will show that the comparative cost of developing a new herbicide to the cost of developing a new genetically modified seed was drastically cheaper to work on the GM strategy. So it really was a way to ensure increased corporate profits. Next slide, please. The next phase I want to talk about is the period of the early 2000s to about 2015, where we saw a rapid rise in global glyphosate use. And in this period, more and more countries were approving GM crops for cultivation. And because such a great percentage of the genetically modified crops are engineered to be resistant to glyphosate, this meant that glyphosate use obviously was going up. And now we're seeing a situation where about 80% of GM crops are glyphosate resistant. So the two technologies of glyphosate and genetically modified crops really go together quite closely. Next slide, please. And it's also interesting in this period because Monsanto's patent did expire after 2000 in the US for glyphosate. And at this time, we also saw a massive rise in the production of generic brands or generic versions of glyphosate. And the global market really expanded for glyphosate use, and much of the production for this generic glyphosate was actually coming from China, where there was a massive increase in productivity of glyphosate in that country. And much of that production of generic glyphosate was actually exported globally. So around this time, China was producing around or supplying around 40% of global glyphosate use. Much of it was shipped to South America. And what's interesting here as well is that when this cheaper, less expensive glyphosate came on the market, Monsanto initially tried to force consumers of its brand of seeds to actually buy the Roundup brand of the herbicide, but eventually, based on the competition, Monsanto eventually reduced the price that it charged for glyphosate as well. And this lower price environment led to a huge increase in use. Next slide, please. And when cheaper glyphosate became available, new uses beyond GM, just simply GM use on GM crops also expanded. So in this period, we saw an increase in no-till agriculture. And in no-till farming, what happens is obviously there's less sort of broad tillage of the land and a drilling of seeds, even on fields, as you can see on the slide here, that have stubble from the previous year's crop. But this kind of farming relies really heavily on glyphosate in order to control weeds because there's no tilling taking place. And no-till agriculture really expanded in this era. Another use at this time was also the growth in the use of glyphosate for what's called pre-harvest desiccation of crops. This is largely done in regions where there's perhaps shorter growing season or a wetter climate, where basically they spray glyphosate on the crop just prior to harvest in order to dry it out to make it work better with the harvesting equipment. So this kind of use also expanded rapidly in this period. Next slide, please. The next phase I want to talk about is 2015 to present, and I call this contestation and response. Around 2015, the IARC of the World Health Organization issued a statement that noted that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic to humans. And this occurred around the same time that a re-registration process for the use of glyphosate was happening in the European Union, in Canada, and in the United States. And Monsanto, the main producer of Roundup, was quite annoyed about this statement and pursued a major PR campaign to defend the chemical. Yet in all three jurisdictions in the US, the EU, and in Canada, use of glyphosate was reapproved, although in the European Union that was limited to just 5 years, and that will expire at the end of this year. So it's an appropriate moment to be discussing this issue. Next slide, please. And in this period also, in response to the IARC's statement about the potential carcinogenic nature, we also saw the massive number of lawsuits against Monsanto, which eventually was purchased by Bayer, which I'll talk about in a minute, and a growing number of other countries that started to ban or restrict use of glyphosate. There are many restrictions around the world in different jurisdictions, local to national, on non-agricultural use, but there are also restrictions on agricultural use as well. And we obviously are having the seminar because this is an issue that Mexico is planning to ban glyphosate along with GM crops from 2024. Germany is as well. And many countries that have made the effort to put restrictions in place have also faced severe backlash from corporate actors who've been pressuring them to reverse those bans. Next slide, please. Also in this more recent period, a response from industry has been largely to push for what they call digital agriculture or more precision techniques. So there is a recognition, especially that weeds are becoming resistant to glyphosate. And so there is a sense that, okay, if we use precision technologies, we can maybe spray a little bit less on the margins, or we can do gene editing to more precisely edit seeds to make them, again, resistant to glyphosate. So what's interesting about this reaction of the industry is they're claiming this as a more environmentally sound method of agriculture, but it's marginally trying to make more efficient use of these chemicals rather than getting rid of them altogether. And I would note this method is of agricultural adjustments that they're doing with digital is cheaper than herbicide development or even biotech development. Next slide, please. And the underlying trend through all of these phases I just talked about is corporate consolidation in the sector. And this consolidation has been happening since the 1970s. We've seen constant mergers and acquisitions across the industry. And now, after the most recent mergers and acquisitions around the period of 2015 to 2018, we now just have 4 firms that are dominating the market. Next slide, please. And the concentration in the sector is creating barriers to entry that dampen innovation. What's really striking is that there's been no new active ingredients for herbicides that have been developed in an over 30-year period. There's been very little attention to alternatives to herbicides as well. So we need to be mindful that this corporate power and market power of these firms, it's not just that it's affecting the economics of the prices they charge, it's also affecting patterns of innovation. And in response to a lot of these critiques, Bayer said, okay, we'll do some research into more environmentally sound herbicide development. But that's, as I said, following a period of nearly 30 years in which no new herbicide active ingredients were brought on the market. Next slide, please. So I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations and also the questions and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and also for being right on time. Next, we'll hear from Víctor Suárez about the elements of the Mexican program to phase out glyphosate and GMOs and how that came about. Víctor Suárez Carrera is Undersecretary for Food Self-Sufficiency in the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. He's an agronomist specializing in agricultural economics. He says his greatest learning has been obtained alongside the struggles of Chinantec, Zapotec, and Mixe communities, as well as campesino organizations such as ANEC, which he led from 1995 to 2017. He served in the Mexican Congress from 2003 to 2006, and today, as Undersecretary for Food Self-Sufficiency, he actively participates in the intersectoral group of Health, Food, and Environment and Competitiveness, which brings representatives of government and civil society together to work for fair, healthy, sustainable, and competitive agri-food and nutrition system. Go ahead, Victor.
Muchísimas gracias a IATP y ANEC por.
Thank you so much to ANEC and IATP for this invitation to participate in this webinar. I'm really pleased to be here and honored to participate along with the other panelists in this important event. Webinar on the transition from agrotechnology to agroecology in Mexico and the challenges in the face of US trade policy. Thank you for sharing my presentation. Next slide, please. The first thing that I would like to comment and share with you is that there is a commitment by the government of President López Obrador in the context of what we call the fourth transformation, to give an end to the neoliberal policies that have been going on since 1982 and transit towards post-neoliberal regime based and focused on the needs of population. Since the first day of his government, December 1st, 2018, the government of López Obrador identified 100 commitments. Among them, a few of them that I will present and share with you. The first one is to give special attention to indigenous peoples and preference in government programs and projects. 2, to attend to all Mexicans under the principle that for the good of all, the poor must come first. 19, to grant economic support for the planting of crops by small-scale producers. 29, to deliver government support directly without intermediaries. And 74, not to allow the use of transgenic seeds and to protect Mexico's diversity and promote agroecological practices that increase productivity. So following those presidential commitments, and in order to put an end to neoliberalism in Mexico and gathering social movements struggles over many decades in the past, the president prepared a presidential decree that was submitted in December 31st, 2020, where he establishes the actions to be taken by the agencies and entities that make up the federal public administration within the scope of their competencies to gradually replace the use, acquisition, distribution, promotion, and importation of the chemical substance called glyphosate and the agrochemicals used in our country that contain it as an active ingredient. Substituted by sustainable and culturally appropriate alternatives that allow for maintaining production and are safe for human health, the country's biocultural diversity, and the environment. This decree from the president, next slide, please. You can find it completely, integrally. Next slide, please. Here you can see the link to the website where you can find the whole text of that presidential decree. Next slide. This decree establishes a set of mandates. A transition period is established for the complete substitution of glyphosate. By 2024, all entities from the federal administration must refrain from acquiring, using, distributing, promoting, and importing glyphosate or agrochemicals containing it as an active ingredient in public programs or any other government activity. And this measure was put in place immediately. Also, it says the ministries of agriculture and environment will promote and implement sustainable and culturally appropriate alternatives to the use of glyphosate with low toxicity agrochemicals, with biological or organic products, with agroecological practices, or with intensive use of labor, which are safe for human health, the biocultural diversity of the country and the environment. Next slide. The National Council of Science and Technology, CONACYT, will coordinate, articulate, promote, and support scientific research, technological developments, and innovations that allow it to sustain and propose alternatives to glyphosate. To this end, CONACYT may call on scientific and higher education institutions or public research centers with competence in the field. The Ministries of Agriculture, Environment, and CONACYT may invite organized groups of farmers, agrochemical industry, associations of agrochemical users, and organizations of bio-input and organic input producers to participate in the design, promotion, or implementation of the aforementioned alternatives to glyphosate. Based on the result of scientific research, technological developments, and innovations, CONACYT will issue annual recommendations to support the amount of glyphosate that will be authorized to be imported by individuals. On this specific point, I would like to comment with you that CONACYT has submitted a declaration on the quantities that the maximum quantities that can be imported and aiming to gradual diminution of glyphosate use, and the volume of imported products was reduced by 18%, and aiming and for 2022 the diminution was reaching 50%. And next year, 25%, and by 2024, 0%. 0 kilos or liters that can be imported to Mexico legally. So the mandates, back to the mandate, by the first half of 2023, the Ministries of Agriculture, Environment, and CONACYT will propose reforms to applicable legislation to prevent the use of glyphosate as an active substance in agrochemicals and genetically modified corn in Mexico. In order to contribute to food security and sovereignty and protect native corn, the milpa, biocultural wealth, peasant communities, gastronomic heritage, and the health of Mexicans, biosafety authorities will revoke and refrain from granting permits to release GM corn seeds into the environment. Based on criteria on sufficiency in the supply of glyphosate-free corn, the biosafety authorities will revoke and refrain from granting authorization for the use of GM corn in Mexican food until its total substitution on a date no later than January 31st, 2024, in accord with food self-sufficiency policies and the transition period. This is the broad mandate coming from the president that is it has been adopted since December 2020. That was a result of a struggle from social movement at the political level as well against transnational and their representatives in Mexico, facing obviously opposition inside the government itself, but aiming to prioritize the well-being of population and above any free trade agreement is the priority of our constitution of our country that really aims and defends the primacy of human rights of our people and counter neoliberal policies that go against the well-being of our population. I would like now share with you what were the reasons to phase out glyphosate. There were reasons for health. Next slide, please. So there were some adverse health effects. Next slide, please. Those were well documented by the World Health Organization. It's an endocrine disruptor. Next slide, please. Provokes damage to organs and systems, metabolic alterations, neurological and chronic degenerative diseases. And we found in Mexico some reminiscence of glyphosate that has impacted children and teenagers in our country, extreme levels in urine, nationally distributed corn-based products, impact on drinking water system. But there was also important damage at the environmental level. It's a widespread environmental pollutant on the atmosphere, water, and spores. There's a reduction of beneficial insect and pollinator population, damage on aquatic and terrestrial organisms, and it's an inhibitor of microorganisms that stimulates sulfurity. Next slide, please. So we see in the next graphic how glyphosate is being used in different crops, mainly on corn and citrus and other crops. So we took the decision to bring forward the glyphosate prohibition ban, and that will be proceeding systematically. Besides the limitation of importations of glyphosate, there's also a strategy of agroecological transition. Next slide, please, in Mexico. And with this, I will end. Next, please. I would like to comment very quickly that the ban is accompanied with agroecological alternatives for the benefits of harvest, and also ban other dangerous pesticides. So we're pushing forward an agroecological transition and bring forward a strategy of integrated products and giving priority to peasants agriculture of small and medium scale production. There's a program that we have that's called Production for Wellbeing that really strikes that transition to agroecological, productive, and resilient agri-food systems where 100,000 of peasants are involved thanks to the support of different technicians and trainers conformed of youth and peasants. Next slide, please. So the objective of this strategy is to strengthen the capacities of the producers involved in the production for well-being program to transition to agroecological, productive, and resilient agri-food systems that allow to improve food self-sufficiency in corn, beans, wheat, rice, milk, coffee, sugarcane, cocoa, honeybee, amaranth, Cheyenne milk. Next. This is a strategy of technical support based on the dialogue of knowledge. At the core is the peasant. It's an integrated strategy of all the production systems following the principles of food self-sufficiency, sustainability, healthy food, and well-being, welfare. Next, we have in the country distributed in 34 regions more than 2,000 schools on rural issues by the public domain in 555 municipalities involving 44,000 farmers and with more than 1,000 technicians, and we're starting that process of transition towards a post-neoliberal system based on a popular mandate where there's no conflict of interest, where there's no intervention of political or economic powers, and with other movements in the world and in Mexico, we hope to transform the agro system at the global level and really confront the control and power and consolidation of transnational corporations against our own sovereignty and our own democratic principles. because they impose unacceptable conditions, also with international institutions being involved in that system. Thank you so much. With this, I would end my presentation. This shows a few pictures of what is the work is being developed in the countryside. I would like to share next. There are different website links that I want to share related to two conferences that we organized, number 22, number 26, where we share agroecological practices, experiences, and showing that it's possible to ban and not use glyphosate and still maintain productivity, lower costs, and obviously confront the negative impacts of glyphosates on our lives.
That was really great. And there's so much rich information in these slides. So I do just want to remind people that we will be circulating the recording and the slides separately. So you will have those details moving forward. Next, we'll hear from Leticia López Cepeda. When Leticia and I started talking about this event, we realized at first I was interested, coming from the US, in what trade pressures might be coming on Mexico on these issues. And she said, those are important, but of course, it's also important to have the alternatives really in action, to have those agroecological alternatives and not simply substitute for another agrochemical. So today we'll hear from her on ANEC's approach to those issues. Maria Leticia López Cepeda is Executive Director of ANEC, which brings together more than 100 farmer and indigenous organizations with more than 50,000 members in 12 Mexican states. Representing ANEC, she is a member of the Without Corn, No Country campaign, the collective demand against planting of GMO corn, and the Mexican agroecology movement, among others. A rural sociologist, she's participated in the design and operation of institutional programs that strengthen campesino organization, as well as in the analysis and promotion of public policies for the countryside. Go ahead, Leticia.
Sí. Muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I will start my presentation by saying that we are experiencing a social uprising in Mexico in terms of agroecological practices. There are many organizations, indigenous, campesina, and all sorts, that are making this transition. That's what I'm going to try to show in my presentation. Of course, the fight continues. As Víctor Suárez already said, I'm going to reiterate a lot of the things here that he said. Can I see the next slide? First thing I'm going to look at here is the decree and banning the planting of genetically modified corn and phasing out of the use of glyphosate. Many years of fight against this. And we're still in front of the challenge of defining and building an agroecological approach to agriculture. We need to look at these alternatives, these sustainable alternatives. And we need to look at how to engage in this revolution. And as Víctor Suárez said, this decree to ban the use of glyphosate science is being controlled, science and technology is being controlled by these transnational corporations. We need a new model so that we can recover the ways of doing agriculture from the past. And we need to make recommendations to do this. In the first half of 2023, institutions will have to promote legal reforms to prevent the use of glyphosate. And we need to look at this to find the right organizations that are in fact supporting this transition. We can't. The hard deadline is on January 31st, 2024, to fully replace glyphosate. People from other countries know that Mexico had a neoliberal system, and we need to work in this direction in order to eliminate this system and create food sovereignty. The supports generally go to big producers, so we need to try to redirect some of them towards smaller producers. We need to provide the supports directly without any middle players. We're using strategic programs. There was a lot of price speculation. We need to have guaranteed prices to make sure that everybody gets their fair share. In addition to the decree, there's the law that protects native corn. And the budget is currently being debated. There's a lot of, there are various laws that are being passed and tabled right now. And we're trying to ensure that we are supporting this transition to move beyond GMO, the use of GMOs. This needs to be a shared duty between civil society and the government. We have that obligation to promote it. What we're seeing in this budget that just came out is that the production side is not driven enough of the entire expense budget. This is the amount going to production. There's a social element here to consider as well. It's great that the budget has increased, but we need to find a better balance. Here you can see there's a big chemical fertilizer program in the budget that takes up a big portion of the budget. The guaranteed price part of this pie chart needs to be supported as well. It's a significant transition, so we need to make sure that we have all sorts of different programs, including for the dairy industry and various other industries. This is a worldwide fight. It brings us all together. We need to decide which agri-food model we want. Eliminating glyphosate, as we said at the beginning of this debate, will be driven through laws that will be guided by this decree. Within our government, the government continues to push the agenda of large agribusiness and corporate producers. And we need to start denouncing this. Unfortunately, it seems as if the sound cut out. It seems.
Perdón, se cortó.
Okay.
Y no me...
Sorry, it cut out. I'm not sure why. Please go to the next slide. I was just saying that this means that with this neoliberal model, and this myth that it's only with these huge multinational corporations that control agribusiness, that we need this model. If you could please go to the next slide. There are many organizations and collectives that are working throughout the country, and we need to make this fight, this struggle visible. To make sure that we're making it obvious, including various organizations from the United States and elsewhere. ANEC has been working for many years, 10 or 11. We have the ASI-MISI, which is the integrated management of various crops. And it's an agroecological model that will help us find different ways to maintain profitability and integrate technologies as well as knowledge to make sure that rural production is healthy and strong. We want to go back to ancestral practices. I'll just quickly say that within this model, we're trying to find resilience, sustainability, and profitability, as well as respect for nature. In terms, we want also to, for the producers to have a decent life, to be able to win their bread. It's a method that will value knowledge and know-how, and as well as improve the quality and the quality of soils, and we need to bring back knowledge of plant nutrition through these various campesino organizations. We can find new ways of recovering these ancestral practices. We need to take account of climatological data as well. This is the methodology that we're developing. In 6 years, several of our producers have adopted these practices, 5,300 farmers. Through various producers of organic fertilizers that will help as well. Other organizations are helping us move this forward, and we're seeing excellent opportunities to promote this policy. And we want to make sure that it's helping producers. We need to find a way to produce inputs on farm. We have a national science and technology plan that is cross-cutting. And that's the major change that we need in order to test our soils, which have been degraded due to the use of chemical fertilizers. The soil is so degraded that we need a special subsidy that hasn't been counted in the cost of production. We need to recover and build the organic matter. And research requires technical assistance. There's many considerations here, and we're really hoping that this meeting will be fruitful, because this is now a global movement, and this is an ongoing debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leticia. I really hated to cut that one short. ANEC has written a lot about these, about the ASIMISI program. We did a joint publication a few years ago, but of course it's all progressed since then. So I hope we'll continue those conversations and hear more about ASIMISI and similar alternatives that are being promoted across the country. Next, we'll hear from Fernando Bejarano on some of the drivers from civil society and the legislature about why this ban, this new action on glyphosate and GMOs is happening. Fernando Bejarano Gonzalez is a sociologist specializing in issues related to the environmental and social impact of pesticide use. He is the director of the Pesticide Action Network Mexico and is the coordinator of the International Pesticide Elimination Network, Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on pesticides and chemicals, including highly hazardous pesticides in Mexico. Fernando, please go ahead.
Sí, muy buenos días a todos y todas.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. As Karen said, we're in a small governmental organization in Mexico. It's known as RAPAM. I'm the coordinator for Latin America for the IPN. I'm the coordinator in Argentina for another organization. We have to consider that this change that our president is trying to take on will counter the negative effects, the harmful effects of privatization and the impunity and violence that is allowed to go on. This comes within a context of dependence on on various pesticides. There are various bodies in these farm schools that are required to move forward with this. There's also a legal architecture to this to strengthen the market. The president took on a big challenge to break down this model and to regain our food sovereignty and the social movements that are needed to get this done. This struggle is significant, and GMO so the 2017 campaign, Without Corn, No Country, was significant in trying to move beyond these GMO crops, and various civil organizations were essential as well, CSOs, NGOs, and academics as well. It was part of the renegotiation process of NAFTA. And it puts Mexico at the center of the cultural heritage of corn. And there's been a popular movement against transgenic corn. Thanks to this demand, this also has allowed the different people to join the cabinet and government. Víctor Suárez is an example, but there are other players, stakeholders. Dr. Arenal is one, who is working on science and technology. So this is all accompanied by mobilization, bilateral actions, which you can see here in the Zócalo in various places. You can see that Without Corn, No Country, that campaign, you can see that it's a struggle by the entire population of Mexico to recover our heritage. Glyphosate is one example of highly hazardous pesticide that is in this new category, international category. You can see the work that we did here that has been translated into English. This is a list of highly hazardous pesticides. $180 different active products in this list here. 140 HHPs that are used in various parts of the world. This is a list here of some of the ones that we used in past governments. They have a red label to indicate their high level of toxicity. It's not just glyphosate. They have endocrine disruptors. Some of them are highly toxic. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We need a longer term plan and perspective in order to move beyond these. These highly hazardous pesticides are used in various places in places like California and in various states in Mexico. They're used in all sorts of places around the country. And the expansion of GMO soy has added to this. This led to a recommendation from various civil organizations, including Greenpeace. This recommendation has to do also with the negligence and of various neoliberal governments and the letting them contaminate our water and do various other harmful things with these highly hazardous pesticides. This should be part of the National Development Plan to reduce the use, progressive use of we want to ensure that these can be monitored and that they can be assessed and measurable. We need to have goals and objectives that are measurable. So Victor Toledo, who is the Secretary of Agroecology, there's a strong push to move in this direction. And they made the decision to ban the imports of glyphosate. And we need to use channel this through the ban through the decree. The imports come mainly from the United States and from China, usually through the United States, but originating in China. Jennifer, who has become a global leader on this. There's obviously Monsanto, but there's other multinational corporations and other players from the generic sector as well. We also have to consider documentation. This study confirmed that there was a presence of highly hazardous pesticides in various corn products in Mexico. With a wide participation of various players in the academic world. They completed studies on glyphosate in Maseca, that is very common throughout the country. There's also scientific documentation that there was glyphosate in the urine of children and adolescents in Jalisco. This was fed by also help and assistance from various organizations. The Action Network throughout the International Action Network as well. Various CONACYT articles that were produced as well. And the endocrine disruption was found to be damaging to various organs. And it also is ecotoxic, so toxic to the environment. I'm not going to repeat what Victor said, but this decree invoked a precautionary principle. As a public policy, this is important because it will help to create self-sufficiency and food sovereignty, culturally appropriate agricultural production. There's an intersecretary, interdepartmental group that is looking at how to refrain from acquiring and using these products. So there's various legal actions that are in play that are being engaged by the decree. Within, there's also the fight against the industry, because we need them to, because the government has been defending GMOs, and they sympathize more with this vision of agriculture, and they support this, but now they support this initiative that integrates, for instance, climate change and the participation of various smaller organizations. So there's a contradiction here, and we need, this government is basically transitioning. There's a part of the industry that supports this, and another component that does not, of course. We have to move beyond the legal challenges by these multinational corporations that are trying to defend their interests. There's pressure from the industry, national industry, crop life, and pressure from the United States. The Secretary of Agriculture. There's also the National Corn Union. And secretaries, ministries, but on the state level, in the state of Hidalgo, that are expressing concern over the lack of access to these various inputs and access to the market. I'm going to end soon. We made 3 demands or requests here. We want them to guarantee the right to know when you can use glyphosate. Bolsonaro in Brazil is supporting, of course, the industry. So we're trying to see how we can reduce the use of pesticides. Here's some of my references. I know I went over a little bit, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Fernando. There's so much important information there. We read about these things in the news as if they just somehow appeared, and it is the result of years of organizing and scientific work by powerful civil society organizations in Mexico. In the next section, the last 2 topics will be on some of the pushback from the United States. So first we'll hear from Sharon Treat about there have been some allegations that what the Mexican government is doing is illegal under NAFTA and that USTR should push back. And she's taken a look at what's actually in the text, so we can look about what's really there and what is hyperbole. Sharon Treat is senior attorney at IETP. Sharon first got involved in trade policy as a state legislator in Maine, where she served 11 terms, holding numerous leadership positions, including Senate Majority Leader. She was executive director of the National Legislative Association on Prescription Drug Prices from 2004 to 2014, and later continued to work with the Center for International Environmental Law and the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, and then as of 2017 with IETP. Her publications include Selling Off the Farm, Corporate Meats Takeover through TTIP, and Preempting the Public Interest, How TTIP, a trade agreement, would limit US states' public health and environmental protections. Sharon?
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and I've already learned a great deal in this webinar. So I've been asked to talk about some of what we just kind of ended up with a little bit from Fernando about the trade agreements and other instruments and industry involvement in trying to prevent Mexico and everybody else basically from changing towards a more agroecological approach and away from hazardous chemicals and GMOs. Next slide. I'm going to jump right to the final point here because I think there's been a lot of talk about the agriculture biotech provisions of the USMCA or TMEC and claims about what they do. So the first thing I would just say is they don't do what the industry says they do, but I do think they're bad because this is a part of the trade agreement that essentially gives industry a platform to kind of make their case and to try to cast doubt on what Mexico is doing and what other countries and jurisdictions would like to do. And it could potentially have a chilling effect on those actions. The provisions of the new NAFTA, many of them are actually worse than the original version of it, and particularly around these issues around chemicals and around GMOs, they are worse. They're intended to promote the use of the technologies that we've just been hearing about. And they're also intended to promote a US version of how regulations should address these technologies. And essentially, the US position has been that GMOs and in particular should just be deregulated and not regulated at all. Next slide. So in the USMCA, there is a section in the agricultural chapter, and I have that posted here in red on the slide, which is chapter 3, and it's a section B is specific to agricultural biotechnology. This was something that the industry, and not only the biotech industry, but of course all of conventional industrial agriculture, wanted very much to see in the new NAFTA. And they were successful in getting this new section. And it's the first time in a US trade agreement where there is this section. But I want to point out that there's other provisions of the trade agreement, which all has to be kind of read together, and all the different chapters inform each other. And other provisions of the agreement also are relevant, not only to GMOs, but also to the glyphosate and pesticide discussion. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Next slide. So this is what Karen was just referring to. Over the last 6 months or so, we've seen industry lobby groups as well as members of Congress start shouting basically about the Mexican programs to reduce glyphosate use and to move away from GMO seeds. And I have here a quote from the head of BIO, which is this lobby group for the biotechnology industry. She was testifying before the US Senate fairly recently, and she said essentially that all of those actions that you've heard about throughout this webinar today are in violation of the USMCA or TMEC, and that the US Trade Representative or USTR should essentially bring in an enforcement action against Mexico as soon as possible to get Mexico to reverse all of these policies that it's doing. And according to Michelle McMurray Heath, the bio president, all of Mexico's actions are in violation of the trade agreement. Next slide. Well, this is not really true. So that's an important thing to point out. Mexico's sovereignty is recognized in the USMCA trade agreement. And I would point you to the environment chapter. We could all say that these statements could be stronger. And of course, there's always, weasel words, shall I say, that try to limit, really strong statements. But the fact is that the environment chapter does recognize the sovereign right of each of the countries that are part of the USMCA to set their own environmental priorities and to establish their policies to carry out those priorities. And I think it's quite significant that there's a specific article on biodiversity that not only says that countries are allowed to address biodiversity, but actually mandates that each of the countries shall promote and encourage conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and also respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge and practices of indigenous peoples and local communities. And so this is quite significant in the sense that this is where a good part of where the Mexican policies are coming from. They are rooted in these very principles, which the USMCA says in this chapter are, in fact, central to the agreement. Next slide. I think you jumped way ahead. Okay. Okay, so this is the next slide. So in addition to this recognition of sovereignty and authority to enact environmental policies and public health policies as well, the agricultural biotech section has some very clear language, which says that Mexico has a right to say no to transgenic, genetically engineered, GMOs, all of this that we've been talking about. There's a clear statement that says this section does not require a party, a country, to mandate an authorization for a product to go onto the market. So it doesn't have to be approved if someone submits something and says, well, we want to sell this. Next slide. So what is required? Well, it's mostly procedural. So there's provisions about information has to be available about how you apply to get your product authorized. The countries have to have an application process that isn't like 1 week of the year. It should continue for the year at various points, be available. There is some language about taking action, but there's no particular time frame about making a decision. And in fact, there's nothing in this that says a country has to actually make a decision on an application. And that's important in terms of some of the complaints that we're hearing from the industry, which is that permits, applications for permits have been sitting in various agencies for a while and they haven't been acted on, and that's in violation of the trade agreement. And that is not necessarily true. There is somewhat more specific language about something that's already been put on the market and is up for a reauthorization. But again, this text encourages action and encourages timeliness, but there's no hard and fast deadline with a timetable put into it. There is a provision which I think is quite bad about novel products. This is new products that nobody has authorized yet anywhere in the world. The agreement says that the countries cannot say, we're not going to authorize this product until somebody else takes a look at it in another country and does perhaps some of the scientific work and thinks about whether or not it's a safe and effective product. And what this says is Mexico and all the other countries in the USMCA cannot link a decision about whether to approve something or not to whether it's already been authorized. So that's an unfortunate thing, but it's not really relevant to this discussion here. Next slide. Very quickly, Mexico is required to manage cross-contamination. That's one of the more mandatory aspects of this provision. And I actually think that kind of helps Mexico's case here, which is focused a lot on trying to prevent cross-contamination and trying to preserve the diversity of its seed going forward. Next slide. So what might be subject to dispute settlement? It is important to point out that this biotech section of the USMCA is enforceable, which means that a country, Canada or the US, could file a case against Mexico and try to challenge policies that those countries say are in violation of the USMCA. There's a number of different grounds that could be used. One of them is whether just basically different interpretations of the plain text of the agreement. Another provision relates to an obligation that a country might have, that they either did something inconsistent with it or they failed to carry out that obligation. A third provision is that if, let's say, the United States company had a, quote, reasonable expectation that a benefit would come to it under the agricultural chapter, but that benefit isn't happening because of some measure by the other country, then there could be a challenge potentially. So just to give you an example of how this might work, a GMO seed authorization isn't a benefit that anyone could expect and be able to pursue enforcement over because it's not mandated by the USMCA. That's the language I talked about earlier. It says, you know, this section doesn't mandate this. So I think that makes it very clear that just because you put in an application for approval of a GMO product doesn't mean that you can expect it will be approved. So no case there. Alternatively, it may be reasonable to expect that Mexico's regulatory agencies will comply with deadlines that are within Mexico's own domestic laws. That might be an expectation of a company that files an application. And that's one of the complaints that's out there, that some of these applications have been sitting around, perhaps not getting addressed. But then again, we know that the US and Canada and other countries do not always comply with their own deadlines for getting their regulations done in time. And the US is certainly guilty of that as well. So it doesn't mean that, you know, someone bringing a challenge on this would in fact win, that there aren't legitimate reasons for it. And this is the type of thing that would go more towards a consultation and a discussion between the countries, you know, in a committee to implement this trade agreement rather than, you know, a enforcement case going before a panel. Next slide. There's also provisions in the SPS chapter that would deal with glyphosate, science-based decision-making, language around risk. And these are provisions that I can't go into a lot of detail here, but do go to the question about whether it is science-based to ban glyphosate. Next slide. And I'm almost done. I see Karen popping up on my screen. So, you know, these are questions, I mean, they are debated. There are trade cases about whether a certain policy is in violation of these provisions about it being science-based or not science-based. We've clearly heard here today that glyphosate, there's a lot of evidence around glyphosate, the impact on public health, impact on the environment. And this is just a slide showing that even in the United States, which on the federal level does not have great policies, protective policies around glyphosate, these are jurisdictions that are regulating pesticides, including glyphosate, around the country. Last slide, next slide. And here's two examples where New York State has banned glyphosate on public lands, and in the state of Maine, where I live, they just passed legislation to ban glyphosate on school grounds. So last slide. contact information, I failed to put a link to my policy brief on the interpretation of the ag biotech, but I know that it was going to be posted in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. That is, whoops. That's so helpful. I think I hear assertions by agro-industry, both on Mexico and on Canada's dairy supply management program, that somehow their expectations aren't being met. And a lot of those expectations are kind of imaginary, I think. In any case, our next and final speaker, will be Amy Van Son from the Center for Food Safety. And she will discuss some of the legal battles in the United States over the approval of glyphosate by the Environmental Protection Agency. Amy is senior attorney at the Center for Food Safety's Portland office. As part of its legal team, Amy practices environmental and administrative law to defend farmers, communities, and the environment from industrial animal factories, aquaculture, genetically engineered crops and animals, and the overuse of toxic pesticides. Amy also works to protect the integrity of organic foods and ensure the transparent labeling of genetically engineered foods. Prior to joining CFS, they served as a volunteer attorney with Earth Justice, working on animal factories on the East Coast, and then litigated complex environmental insurance cases at a law firm in Manhattan. Amy is admitted to the bar in Oregon and New York. Amy, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to see if my screen share is working. Can you see? If someone can let me know, do you see the presentation or are you seeing the presenter mode?
We're seeing the presenter mode.
Okay, let me just fix that. I know I've done this before the correct way, so I'm gonna try to get it again. I think, wait, slideshow. Yes, okay, this should work. Does that look better?
Yep, that looks
okay,
like
we did it. Hooray, technology. Thank you so much for having me on this webinar. I've learned so much and it's really great to be speaking alongside so many experts and advocates who've been fighting for so long. And I'm just so thrilled to hear that Mexico's been able to do this, banning glyphosate, because it's terrible, as we've heard. And I'm going to talk about what we're doing at Center for Food Safety to try to fix our federal regulation of glyphosate in the US. So I'm a senior attorney with Center for Food Safety, and Center for Food Safety, I'm trying to advance my slide, there it goes, is a national nonprofit organization. We have about 1 million members nationwide, and we work to empower people, support farmers, and protect the environment from the harmful industrial food production, including by promoting actually sustainable agriculture like agroecology and organic and beyond. So pesticides are one of the big program areas that we work on. So just a quick overview of the law we're talking about in the US, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, because nobody wants to say that more than once. Congress amended FIFRA in 1996 and 2007 to require EPA to go back and review pesticides that it had previously registered under this law that were older, and then to reevaluate them periodically. So what we're talking about in terms of our current case is the interim registration review process. So one of these was to re-register old pesticides, and then the periodic reevaluation is called registration review. And EPA has to look every 15 years at whether a pesticide that was previously registered continues to meet the standard for registration. And so the FIFRA standard is that the pesticide should not cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment, and that includes human health. So right in there, there's this cost benefit type balancing that happens, because what is an unreasonable adverse effect? You know, where is that line? So but that's the safety standard that all pesticides must meet before EPA can register them. And this review process is meant, as EPA's regulations tell us, to ensure that these pesticides that this continuing registration is based on current scientific and other knowledge regarding the pesticide and its impacts on human health and the environment. So we're supposed to be taking the science that has been evolved for the last 15 years since the last, re-registration of that pesticide, and see what the current science says. Because a lot of, as we know, always evolving, a lot of things change, and how a pesticide use can also change. As we saw in the, I think, very first presentation, the huge increase in the amount of glyphosate used with the advent of GMO crops by Monsanto really changed the game here. So a little bit on the background of glyphosate's own history. It was first registered in 1974 and was re-registered under those amendments in 1993, which, as the first presentation showed, was right around the time that the big boom in genetically engineering cash crops and field crops was happening. Not surprisingly, or not coincidentally. So its interim registration review was due, supposed to be every 15 years, or its registration review decision was supposed to be complete in 2009, but EPA actually started the review in 2009. It said it would take 6 years, and it took nearly twice as long. All registration review decisions are supposed to be done by October of this year, 2022. So that's the current statutory deadline that EPA is up against. In 2020 was quite a year. At the same year that Mexico was taking these amazing historic steps, EPA issued its final interim registration review decision. So just briefly, the registration review is the overall process, and EPA's own regulations created this interim registration review where it can say, well, we're not done with our final decision, our every 15-year update, but in the interim, in the meantime, we're going to finalize what we can and maybe add some mitigation measures. So that's what they did. And this, I should say, does not come from the statute itself. This interim process is something that EPA created on its own. So what it finalized in 2020 was the human health risk assessment, which is one of the major 2 risk assessments it does, is human health and the environment. And this risk assessment found that there was no occupational risks at all, meaning no health harms, no risk to people who are exposed to glyphosate in their work. Either they're spraying it or they're farm workers that are exposed to it, any occupational risk. They said there was none. Their ecological risk assessment also found there were no unreasonable adverse risks based on mitigation measures that I will get to. It also did its cost benefit analysis, which again is to determine, there might be some costs, some risks, adverse risks, but we balance that against the benefit of the pesticide. They did that in a single sentence. And historically, EPA's cost benefit analyses here have been really bad because they just assume the benefits of the pesticide without really proving them, and then they will really downplay the costs. We actually won on this issue in court in our challenge to the dicamba registration for over-the-top use on GMO crops, and the court said, yeah, you have to do better than that. But in this registration review decision, EPA said, okay, we're going to put in a few interim mitigation measures that would go on the label of these products. However, they were totally inadequate. They really were just saying use as is labeled. They really didn't add any protection. And EPA has not to this day actually required manufacturers like Bayer, Monsanto to update their labels. So they're not doing anything, these mitigation measures. So the human health impacts are really the major part of the case right now, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But EPA originally characterized glyphosate as a potential carcinogen. In 1985, it classified it as what today would be considered having suggestive evidence of cancer. And it was based in 1983, there was a study that Monsanto conducted, an animal feeding study, that discovered a statistically significant increased risk of cancer in mice who were treated with glyphosate. Monsanto later convinced EPA that it should ignore these results and claim that, this study isn't definitive because a single mouse who was not exposed to the pesticide also developed a tumor. Monsanto refused to replicate the study and put years and years of pressure on EPA. I mean, you can read all about this in various places. Carrie Gillam has done some amazing work uncovering, as these cases are going to court with people suing Monsanto directly for after getting cancer. There's a lot of these papers are coming out about just how much Monsanto has done over the years to pressure scientists and journalists and everything. So they got what they wanted, and EPA said for years that there's no cancer risk to glyphosate. Of course, as you know, in 2015, the World Health Organization's cancer experts concluded glyphosate is probably carcinogenic and associated it with an increased risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And as I just mentioned, there's tens of thousands of plaintiffs that are suing what is now Bayer for failing to warn of the risk after them or their loved ones have contracted NHL. Bayer lost all 3 of its initial trials. These were sort of the bellwether trials to see what was going to happen with this. So after losing, they announced that they were going to do this $10 billion settlement and end homeowner use of glyphosate in the US. Of course, the major use is agricultural as opposed to homeowner, and no farm workers, as far as I can tell, are actually yet part of these class action cases for obvious reasons. It's very difficult to come forward and put your name on a case, especially if you're undocumented, and the farmers that employ farm workers, can be, of course, very abusive, and there could be a lot of retaliation. So it's not really surprising, but it just means that this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the number of people who have been impacted by exposure to glyphosate. In addition, I think, as I saw put in the chat, farm workers often don't know what they're being sprayed with because there's so many different toxic chemicals in use in agriculture in the US. But despite all of this evidence that's been out there since the last re-registration of glyphosate in 1993, EPA still concluded that glyphosate is not likely to cause cancer and has no impacts to the health of people who are exposed at work. Had some internal inconsistency here because their cancer assessment actually said it could come to no conclusion as to the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They said there's a lot of different evidence out there. We're not going to make a conclusion about this. But then they still said overall, there's no cancer risk. So that's an internal inconsistency that cannot be squared with the science. One of the ways EPA got to this conclusion is that it didn't require any skin penetration studies. So studies to look at how much glyphosate actually gets through your skin into your bloodstream when you're exposed. However, skin contact is a major route of exposure for people who are exposed at work, especially farm workers. EPA also failed to look at the impacts from the formulated product, so the Roundup that's on the shelf, which is what actually gets sprayed in the real world. Of course, they only assess the impacts from glyphosate, the active ingredient. So there's a huge problem there because even Monsanto's own scientists recognize that other ingredients in these products, so-called inert ingredients, actually increase the absorption of glyphosate into the bloodstream. That's in fact what ingredients like surfactants are designed to do. They're supposed to increase the absorption of the active ingredient, glyphosate, into the plant. Monsanto's own scientists have also said, we have no idea if our products cause cancer because we haven't tested every formulated product. And another big issue here, like I mentioned, and as again, the first presentation made clear, the number of products with glyphosate have expanded tenfold since 1993. So the whole point here of looking at the new science and the new use of this pesticide in the last 15 years, EPA is totally ignoring the fact that there are so many more products that have all these different types of ingredients in them. So there's really no way to know how much glyphosate is being absorbed into the skin without the skin penetration studies. EPA essentially decided that workers could bathe in glyphosate without injury, which is obviously ridiculous given the latest scientific evidence, especially the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma risk. There was internal disagreement here at EPA. their Office of Research and Development, which is a separate office from the Office of Pesticide OPP. I'm blanking on what it stands for, but the pesticide office that approves pesticides is different. And the Office of Research and Development actually found that there was suggestive evidence, at least suggestive evidence of cancer, and some even said that the IARC probable level is what EPA should have concluded. And this memo, we found this memo that surfaced last year. It was not even part of our case because EPA whistleblowers gave it to journalists at The Intercept. So there's a great series of articles from The Intercept all about this, where EPA's higher ups, are burying the science. And so that office agreed that there was evidence, especially of NHL risk. And then EPA's own scientific advisory panel, which it said it gave its cancer assessment and said, here, please review this. They, some of their members disagreed. Some of them said that they agreed with the IARC's designation. Some agreed with EPA's no cancer designation, but there was no consensus between them agreeing with that. And they blasted EPA on a number of things. One was rejecting epidemiological studies and meta-analyses of the same, which showed an increased risk of NHL. And meta-analyses are important because they take a lot of different studies and combine them together to get a much more statistically significant and accurate result. And the scientific advisory panel said, EPA, you should really be looking at these meta-analyses. They also told EPA, you're ignoring all these animal studies, which showed tumors from glyphosate, and violating your own cancer guidelines in order to reject these studies. And there's a lot of detail, scientific detail on what they did, but basically at every turn they said, oh, well, that's not good enough, that's not good enough. And so that they could say there's no evidence in animal studies, there's no epidemiological evidence. They just ignored all of this. So their own advisory panel is saying that you did it wrong.
Amy, I'll need you to wrap up.
Okay. The ecological harms, I think, have probably been covered pretty well. And the destruction of monarch habitat is one that we're especially concerned about. Someone in the chat already mentioned this, but part of our case was that the EPA failed to look at endangered species. And then later its evaluation showed that 93% of them would likely be adversely affected. So this is thousands of species. The Biden administration came in and said, we actually didn't do a good job here. So I'll just put this up on the thing. So basically we sued right after this case, right after the interim decision in 2020, Monsanto and Bayer intervened. We're suing on behalf of farm workers as well as wildlife conservation organizations. And as I mentioned, the Biden administration said, we want to take this back. So we wound up really just briefing the issues on human health and the ESA. And we had oral argument on January 10th, and we are still awaiting our decision. So we'll see what happens here, but that was the basis of our challenge. And we have lots more about that on our website. And feel free to contact me. Sorry for going over. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. That is so much great information. I've been seeing a lot of links to publications posted in the chat, and we will do our best to compile those when we send follow-up information. I've been looking at the questions and answers. We have about 15 minutes left. So I've tried to group some of the questions I've seen, and then I'll raise these and we'll let the panelists answer. One set of questions I've seen is people asking, can agroecology be used at scale? Is it possible for us to produce enough corn or other crops to feed us without prices soaring very high? And specifically in Mexico, if GMO corn won't be imported by 2024, what will be the effects on the prices of tortillas, beef, and dairy? So is there someone who would like to take on that question? Ideally, kind of briefly, perhaps in a couple of people in 5 minutes. Can agroecology feed the world? Fernando.
Yeah, well, there are other documents. Perdón, ahora estoy hablando en inglés. Hay otros reportes que es
There are other
posible.
reports that show that it is possible. And that it can be integrated into the commercial trade sector, and that it can be part of the agroecological, it could be part of the agribusiness system. We need to strengthen the ecological portions of the system as well by not only having monocultures, etc. The director of the agro sector in Mexico, in Sinaloa, commercial scale farmers use glyphosate. They use as part of the Green Revolution. We've stopped using glyphosate. We have reduced our use of glyphosate. Leticia could speak to the types of technical assistance that's required to transition into these new systems. There's price manipulation, of course, by other interests on the international level and the national level.
Leticia.
Sí, uno de los argumentos.
One of the arguments that people in the agribusiness make is that if we don't use technology and the use of outside inputs, we won't have any productivity. But of course, they're not accounting for the loss of soil, the degradation of our soil and the degradation of our environment. And so one of the bigger risks that we need to fight right now is green capitalism. And we need to restructure our approach to integrate biotechnology and its various uses. But we need to do a lot of research in order to figure out how we're going to integrate agroecology into our system in order to assure that we can move towards this new agri-food model. And to see how we can go through all the steps, all the way from production right to consumption. But this argument that we need to use outside inputs no longer makes sense, including the profitability of crops. But in addition to the food sovereignty argument, we need to figure out how producers can get fair prices for their products as well. We can't just leave these producers to keep working these degraded soils. This is a major issue here. Agribusiness are so interested in controlling the genetic aspects of these seeds as well, and so you have to consider the resistance of weeds, etc. We're always going to feel the weight and the pressure from these multinational corporations, and they're always going to make these kinds of arguments. And they keep manipulating the research. I'm just going to finish by saying that the struggle in the United States is also essential to this battle. And we need to harmonize our work together between all peoples, because this research and this work on different trade agreements is essential. And like Fernando said, we need to do the same things in agroecology as we did with this green revolution and figure all that out. So thank you.
Thank you. I also had several questions. There were several questions in the chat asking if the Mexican government is trying to advance these proposals, these kinds of issues at the international level, especially in Latin America, because the issues around GMOs and glyphosate are big problems in places like Guatemala or Argentina. Is that conversation happening, and how should it happen?
Bueno, yo pienso que
that the idea or the need to change the food system is not just the responsibility of the government, it's also organizations that are involved in this. The discussions that were had with Brazil and Argentina, we don't know the details. Argentina has a huge problem with the scale, and Brazil as well. The huge strength and power of these massive exporters mean that these interests are very strong, and the pressure for GMO crops there is stronger. However, as part of civil society, it's very essential that we organize and grow this type of work with our colleagues in Latin America, not only at the national level, but also at the state level. And put more pressure on at the federal level as well. You already said, Fernando, that what's happening in Mexico is that our Secretary of Agriculture is there to defend the interests of multinational corporations. And that this goes against the mandates of their government. All the research in Central America and South America, etc., will help us put on the diplomatic pressure that we need in order to get the word out and integrate this into our legislation. This is a space that we need to explore and we need to move forward with social organizations. We need to participate in order to make sure that this transition goes through. We need to denounce that these transnational corporations, their interests are not coming first. And this comes through helping on the ground, but also on the legislative level. Interinstitutional collaboration is essential for this. This is essential in order to reach this level of food sovereignty that we're seeing.
Put Jennifer on the spot a little bit. You're involved in a lot of different international processes, like the Committee on Food Security and IPES Food. Are these issues specifically around glyphosate and GMO, but more broadly, agroecology? How are these coming up in these international circles? Do you see the Mexican proposals being discussed there?
Sorry, Karen, I missed the beginning. I assume you were speaking to me.
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Is that correct? Yeah, no, just to say that in CFS and the work of the HLPE, obviously we did a big report on agroecology in 2019, and the CFS process has just approved guidelines on agroecology, like promoting agroecology at the national level. And so agroecology has it's recognized that the CFS is having lots of potential as a more sustainable way of production. And it often goes hand in hand with promotion and discussion of territorial markets as well in these policy contexts, because it's understood that more local and regional kinds of markets might work better with a sort of agroecological kinds of production. And so it's a big transformation that's being discussed. And obviously, yes, IPES Food as well has done reports on agroecology. So it's definitely coming into these kind of policy circles more and more as a viable means of food production and food production for all in a sustainable manner. I also just wanted to pick up on a little bit on one of the comments, I think it was in the chat, and a little bit in discussion on the costs of switching away from glyphosate to other mechanisms for controlling weeds. And just to say that the weed resistance problem means reaching for even more toxic herbicides. And so it's really important to pull back away from all herbicides, not just switch from one to the other. And also the point Leticia made about it's really important that farmer livelihoods support their well-being. Sorry, my cat just jumped out. And it's part of the problem with these cost studies. There are lots of studies out there saying, oh, getting rid of glyphosate is going to be very costly for farmers. It's because the whole system itself is based on a particular model that is very locked into the industrial process. And so again, the transition to more ecological agriculture is a much broader process and requires action on many different levels. Thanks.
Thanks. We have about 2 minutes left. I see Amy says she has answered some of the questions already in the Q&A, but I want to give Amy and Sharon a chance to make any last comments, or else we can open it up a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I actually just want to highlight something that I said in the chat or in the Q&A in answer to a question that, a lot of people were asking about the whole formulations of these glyphosate products and their danger, and they do have an increased danger of harm to the environment and to human health than just the active ingredient alone. And we at Center for Food Safety, we currently have a petition before EPA that would require them to actually test, make the registrants do testing on all of the end, whole formula products of these pesticides, of all pesticides, not just glyphosate. So we're trying to improve what we can on the federal pesticide law. There's efforts in Congress to enact PACTPA, protecting America's children from toxic pesticides, which would really reform the whole law itself. But we're doing everything we can at the highest levels as we can to try to improve how we protect our children and our farm workers and our environment in the US. And thank you again for having me.
Sharon?
Not much to add in my 1 minute. I would just say that forums like this are really, really important. When the new NAFTA was being negotiated, Karen and myself were down in Mexico City. We met with many of the people that are on this webinar. We've been sharing information. And one thing to remember about trade agreements, yes, they can be imposed on Mexico, but the United States is also a party to it. And that means that these same kinds of potential restrictions that are out there that could be imposed on Mexico could also be imposed on the United States. And therefore, there are all kinds of allies in the United States and in Canada who should be aware of the fact that they could be forced into policy approaches that they don't agree with, and make it more difficult to make changes. So I think that just as a kind of a final thought here is this kind of working together and sharing of information is vitally important if we are going to make the shift that everyone is talking about.
I think that's a great way to end. We will be circulating information, the recordings of the webinar and the slides. I think the recording in both Spanish and English. And I hope this will be a first step for all of us to stay in touch and to keep helping each other on these issues. Thank you very much.